It's wonderful to be here. Congratulations on getting this film done. I wanted to begin, though, before I talk to the producers and the makers of the film, to introduce President Jimmy Carter as a special guest who's calling in from Georgia. Are you with me, President Carter?
Hello, everybody. This is Jimmy Carter. Thank you very much for wondering. Thank you all. Thank you all for having me out.
Yeah, it's a great film, and thank you, Mr. President, for calling in.
Thank you, President.
The producers have done a great job.
They have, and we're going to be talking to them right now and looking at Willie Nelson and Bob Dylan and the Allman Brothers and Capricorn Records and Ray Charles and all the rest.
That's great. Thank you and good night.
Okay. Good night, Mr. President. I wanted to start with you, Chris. Must be a thrill for you. You make a documentary. You have the former president of the United States call in and give you his well wishings. Tell me how it felt to have President Carter checking in.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of indescribable, to be honest with you. I think the bigger feeling is when Mary and I went to Plains in January to show the film to President Carter and to the First Lady and his family, and not only getting his endorsement, not only having him be excited to see the film, but watching the emotion that it evoked in him and sort of how it brought him back to the time period that we were depicting. And also to have him say to us at the end that he wouldn't have changed a thing. And I mean, you know the president quite well. He is a very gentle man on some level, a very compassionate man, but as a former naval officer, he can be very exacting. And so the fact that he approved and said he wouldn't have changed a thing was pretty important to us.
Was there one part of your documentary that he seemed particularly moved or touched by?
Actually, I'm going to jump in
go ahead.
Say that when there's a moment in the film when Mrs. Carter gets a lot of shine, and in the archival footage that we show, when he's sort of expressing his gratitude to the fact that he had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's thanking Mrs. Carter for kind of being there for him. And in the footage, he can't quite even say her name without sort of getting his voice breaks because he's so emotional in sharing his gratitude towards her. And in that moment in the film, I looked over at him and he was visibly in tears. And that was pretty, trust me, there were a lot of tears going around in that room that day.
What made you, Mary, want to do this documentary? It's a brilliant idea for all the reasons we've just seen in the documentary. But was there a trigger point? Was it the Rolling Stone endorsement of Jimmy Carter or Willie Nelson, the Allman Brothers? What made you realize to look at Carter and American music and make a documentary?
Well, it was really Chris's idea he came to me with this. He had heard the stories, and I can let him, tell the story of how he came across it. But I will just say that, I'm sort of a bit of a music nerd, and when I learned about this from Chris, I was shocked that I had never heard of it. But I grew up in the South. I come from Tallahassee, Florida, which is about, a few hours drive away from Plains, Georgia. And I was just like, the moment he told me about this, and I didn't even know the half of it at that point, I was just like, I want to know more. And I knew that if I wanted to know more, that other people would too. So it was so surprising. And that's what I think is so great about, what makes the film so great. And, it was really, but it was Chris that just sort of discovered this and decided to make it happen. And he was the one that really made it happen. So. Well,
Chris, what was your inspiration? Was it the fact that President Carter quoted Bob Dylan so often, and why not the best, or in his inaugural, or what was or Willie Nelson at the White House? What triggered your real interest in this topic?
that all came later. I'm also from the South, also from North Florida, from Jacksonville. So the Allman Brothers, Leonard Skinner, all of that music meant a lot to us growing up, and President Carter meant a lot to us growing up. But I was actually working on researching a documentary on the Allman Brothers, and doing research and trying to raise financing, and was introduced to a gentleman in Atlanta, Todd Smith, who said, "Listen, Chris, if you want to find out about the Allman Brothers, I know some guys who worked in the Carter White House who have some amazing stories." And so he introduced me to Peter Conlon and Tom Beard, who had worked in the White House. And so we went and met with them, and they did tell us some amazing stories about Carter and the Allman Brothers. And quite frankly, I was ready to leave. They were very nice and engaging. And they said, "Well, do you want to hear some other stories?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, what about Bob Dylan?" I said, "What do you mean, Bob Dylan?" And so then they'd go into that relationship. And as Mary said, I just never had heard of that. And then I thought, well, that's enough. I'm also ready to go. And they said, "Well, do you want to hear about Willie Nelson?" So they were very generous and spent a lot of time. And that, Peter and Tom sharing those stories sort of sparked that idea. And as Mary said, I was so excited. I had dinner with some of the people that were in that meeting that day. And on the way back to the hotel, I called Mary and I said, "Mary, we have to do this."
And I was so mad because he wouldn't tell me what it was at first. He was like, it was like a state secret. Like he had this big secret that he wouldn't tell me because he was on a cell phone and he was afraid someone might be listening. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like,
it was a secret. It obviously was a secret because no one knew the story. So, but anyway.
Tell me about the Capricorn Records and its role in making Georgia and Phil Walden. How seminal was that, do you think, in the birth of Southern rock and then of course leading into Carter's presidency? Southern rock was a big deal.
Totally. I mean, it was, Phil Walden had this background of he had worked with Otis Redding and the record industry was very different back then, but there were a lot more, sort of small independent labels that could have, a bigger impact. And he started, he wanted to have this similar to like what they had in Muscle Shoals with Fame Studios. They had like kind of a studio and not necessarily a house band per se, but they were a place that, in those days, like if you were a musician, to get on the radio was like a whole thing that most people didn't have any sense of how that could happen. But here was this record label in Georgia of all places. And, like Trisha Yearwood talks about in the film, being aware of Capricorn Records and checking out what they were doing because she was in Georgia growing up and she wanted to be a recording artist. So it was inspirational for a lot of people that even existed, I think.
Chris, when I recently saw an unpublished diary that Bob Dylan wrote of when he was in Atlanta touring with the band, and in the diary, Dylan's writing about the meeting with Jimmy Carter down there when they all went and kind of crashed the governor's mansion. He actually has it in diary notes that have been saved. Could you just reflect for a minute, Chris, on the relationship between Carter and Dylan?
It seems, now that we know the history and, having spent time with Bob Dylan and obviously talked to President Carter and Chip Carter, it all somehow does make sense. But when we initially heard the stories, quite frankly, it didn't make sense at all. But it was this amazing thing, as you know, because you spent a lot of time with Bob Dylan. He was humbled by the president, then the governor. And, here's this big rock star who's humbled because here's this guy from another world who's a star in his own world, in his own right. And just how they had that sort of, that relationship. They came from very different places. As Willie Nelson says in the movie, Willie and President Carter come from the same place, but Bob Dylan and President Carter could not have come from more different places. There is an interesting story that's not in the movie, and we had a lot of stories that we just couldn't fit in the movie, but Chip Carter in the 60s had driven up to Woodstock to sort of almost stalk Bob Dylan, if you will. And actually they got stuck in the snow, but Bob Dylan took them in and fed them, and that was sort of the beginning of that relationship. And as Chip talks about in the film, he really loved Dylan, and President Carter really loved Dylan too, and really loved the lyrics and what he stood for politically.
Yeah, I think once President Carter told me just how much he really liked the period of Dylan, The Times They Are Changing album in particular. And of course, Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm, which he evoked, talking about, I never really understood the plight of sharecroppers until I heard Dylan's songs. I find it interesting that after that, their initial meeting there, and when Carter was governor, they both went on to win Nobel Prizes in their own right. But let me switch over to Mary and ask her, which of all of the bands that you listen to, I know the Allman Brothers are kind of a focal point here, and playing softball with Jimmy Carter and all of that. But what music, when you were making this, that you really started listening to more, that you really got personally engaged with, like, wow, I wish I would have been focused on that particular band or singer earlier?
Well, I have to say one thing that's not part of the movie, not because we didn't want it to be, but because we couldn't find the footage of it, but in the wonderful jazz concert that we have, that incredible moment with Dizzy Gillespie and President Carter, is amazing. But there was another artist that played that night that, for whatever reason, the cameras that were shooting the concert didn't capture. And Carter talked about how much he loved the pianist. Oh my God, I'm having Chris help me. Well, who's the name of the jazz artist that we tried to, Cecil Taylor. Sorry, I just had a momentary.
Yeah, there's the great picture of Cecil, right?
Yeah, so he's a really avant-garde jazz artist that I was not really that familiar with, quite frankly. And Carter is such a eclectic in his musical taste, and he loved this pianist, and it's kind of like amazing that he even performed in this kind of setting, and that President Carter was a fan of that kind of real, like, sort of atonal, super avant-garde jazz. And that was something that I was like, wow, like, it blew my mind.
that was the interesting thing. Again, those early stories from Tom Beard and Peter Conlon, around rock and roll and Southern rock, and that made sense to us on some level. And even Bob Dylan on some level. But then you talk to people like Frank Moore, and he turned us on to the whole jazz and classical angle. And then you talk to Jim Free, and he brings in the whole Nashville thing. And so it really, I mean, as Mary said, it's very hard to find somebody with that eclectic, that range of musical taste and real knowledge too. I mean, he truly knows music.
Do you think, how much do you feel this, in the little bit that we got to hear President Carter, as we're talking about gospel music, for a moment there, how important do you think the Christianity is, the way he's absorbed music, like being a member of the Baptist church and singing songs and hymns and Sunday schools and the like?
Well, gospel music is, sort of, if you go back to sort of the roots of music, popular music in America, it all stems from gospel, really. And even just sort of going back into the history of humanity, the first music that we made was spiritual music, right? Whether it's African drums or whatever kinds of spiritual music, every culture has some form of that. And so, President Carter's a deeply spiritual man, and it's no surprise to me that he connected with gospel music. And I think that, his kind of the fact that he connects so much with music to me, it's sort of indicative of that. Like, that's a real, like, it makes sense to me when you realize that. you know.
But Douglas, to your point, I mean, that was, if you think of all the music, that was the foundation, though. That was the sort of the foundational part for him.
What about Chris? How much do you think President Carter's identified with Southern artists? You know, people that were from the south of the Mason-Dixon line, both for rhythm and blues, gospel, country. That it was a product of his culture, some of his taste in music.
I think that certainly played a role, but I mean, as he said, that was really proximity as opposed to anything else. You know, either proximity or bands that he actually got to know and became friendly with. But again, I mean, he talks about it in the movie and certainly talked at length with us about it. You know, whether it was Chicago or Nashville or other areas. So he wasn't. Yes, that was an important part, and it was, again, because of they were his neighbors and kinfolk, to use a word like that. But it was very wide ranging. He was definitely not focused on one genre.
Yeah, Mary, did you, when we were mentioning some of the Capricorn record artists and the Allman Brothers stories, what do you think was the special relationship that developed between Greg Allman and Jimmy Carter? And I was so moved that President Carter a few years ago went to Greg Allman's funeral, even though he was having his own personal health struggles at the time, but wanted to make sure that he was there. What was that friendship like?
I mean, from what I can see, it's just they recognized in each other a certain kind of, they're just, there's an honor and a realness to President Carter that is very apparent. And I think that the story that we tell about President Carter kind of sticking by Greg, even when he had, troubles with the law, that it could have really been political suicide for President Carter to remain, friends and connected with Greg Allman, and everyone told him to back away and you can't associate with this guy. And yet instead, on the very first day that Carter moved into the White House, he invited Greg Allman to dinner. That's just like, you don't find people like that are that kind of true friends in the world very often. And when you do, you hold on tight to them, for sure.
That's exactly right. And, I was always impressed, which I'm impressed with everything Jimmy Carter's done in his life. He's a magnificent man and humanitarian, and the world just loves him so much. And he was so busy in the White House when Elvis Presley would call him, and he would talk with Elvis, for a while. When we're talking, let's talk rock and roll. What's President Carter's, feelings for people like Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley?
We didn't talk that much with him about classic rock and roll, because even it's interesting in the interviews that he did during the presidential election in 1976. And you got to remember that these were different times. And I guess he probably would have been in his 40s then. And that would have been old for, his children listened to rock and roll. And that was a way that he kind of connected with his children, was to listen to their records with them. Whereas now that seems sort of funny and quaint, right? But so I know that, he talks about, he says that Elvis Presley was sort of a distant cousin of his. And that was a story that we, it didn't make it into the film, and much to the dismay of our writer, actually, because he'll till the day I die, I'm sure he'll be like, you should have put that in there, Mary.
Well, that's okay, Mary. You have a great film archive now that you've recorded, and you guys are saving this material, and it's being valuable for historians, because I think you both are really honed in on a very important topic. For example, when Jimmy Carter ran in when he ran for president in 1976, getting the endorsement of Rolling Stone was a very big deal. And having the Democratic convention in Madison Square Garden, the Rolling Stone party, was a great deal. Was there, Carter was very willing to be a born again Christian and be open about his faith, but rock and roll, that era often seemed like sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah.
Tell me about the unity. How did Carter, I think you cover it in the film, but just reflect for a minute on how important that sort of youth vote was in 76 and to be at least a little bit hip about pop music.
Well, it was huge because, from what I understand, it was the young people's vote that actually helped Carter get into office. And, obviously that's historically, it's very hard to get young people to vote. They're not as engaged in politics often. And I very much hope that, this year things will change. We need the young people to get involved because they've got great ideas and come join us, be part of society, but connecting with the youth voters through, quoting Bob Dylan at the National Convention, through, being on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine was so huge. And it's important to remember too, that back then there was this huge divide between, the establishment and the counterculture, and there was no crossing over in those days. So for him to kind of make that step over the line was unheard of. And that's why I think it's kind of the most surprising to a lot of people now, because even the title of the film, Rock and Roll President, even though the movie isn't just about rock and roll, I really wanted to use that title because I thought that rock and roll connotes just kind of a rebellion of a certain sort that you don't identify President Carter with normally. And then we found out that he really liked that title, and it was just like, oh, well, that's
I love the title, Rock and Roll President. He is the rock and roll president. And when I was 16, when he ran for president, I thought it was so great because he would wear blue jeans and be barefoot and be eating on a paper plate and talking with, being with people like Dickie Betts and Greg Allman and the whole Eat the Peach album by the Allman Brothers. But I always think, anytime I hear Willie Nelson sing, I always think of Jimmy Carter, because somehow they both have the same kind of down-home spiritual essence about them. They're both so, their humility and humanity comes across. In our few minutes left, tell me about Willie Nelson and Jimmy Carter, which is a very special relationship.
They're best friends. I mean, Carter actually said to us his two best friends in the world are Willie Nelson and Bob Dylan. And that's pretty cool. Willie is just, they get each other. It's like, I can imagine that those two could sit on a porch and not say anything, and they don't have to. They just get each other. When I tried to actually in the interview press Willie to so when you do hang out, what do you guys talk about? He was like, we don't really have to talk. It's that kind of friendship, which is amazing.
They have incredible shorthand. And of course, the honor when Dylan did his Music Cares talk and Jimmy Carter introduced him a few years ago. Well, I just want to tell you, it's an incredible film. You guys both should be exceedingly proud. Congratulations. It was magnificent to have President Carter call in and just give you that kind of respect. And I think we've got to remember what a national treasure Jimmy Carter is because of his open-mindedness, his ability. Duke Ellington once talked about no boxes. Jimmy Carter doesn't care whether somebody's LGBTQ or whether Willie Nelson smokes pot or Greg Allman had a drug problem. His heart is one that takes in people that he likes, and his love is very full. And I think you captured an element of his presidency that scholars haven't properly done. There are a lot of books on Jimmy Carter, but you guys looked at this very crucial part of him, because in music is his spirit. And I hope tonight when people sign off, beyond watching your film again, we listen to Georgia on My Mind. You can have Willie's version or Ray Charles's version, but it's always Jimmy Carter's version, that great Hoagie Carmichael song, which whenever you hear it, it makes you think of President Carter, who, like a lot of it, always went back to his hometown like Harry Truman did, and is part of the red clay soil of Georgia. He's a man of the earth, and his taste in music is impeccable. And the friendships that you show in this documentary are just really well done. Congratulations to the both of you.
Thank you.
Douglas.
Thank you so much.